I've watched the first 2 minutes of Calvin Smith, Answers in Genesis, Canada, in Common Argument for Evolution Dismantled. I hear a lot of projecting.
How do you know what you know? Your beliefs about many things, however sincerely you hold them, may simply be wrong. And when you think it through, you'll realize that aside from personal experience and logic, you know what you know based on what you've been presented by authority figures and accepted as truth. Humans sometimes provide wrong information unwillingly, simply because they unwittingly make mistakes in their calculations or communication or through faulty reasoning or data collection.
Which is probably why Answers in Genesis doesn't do any original research. If you don't do the original work, no one can point out the flaws in your methodology. The few times that they do the original work, the results expose just how bad AIG science is. Like when Rob Carter made a video on how humans could genetically result from a common ancestor living just 4,000 years ago. But in his theory, he used the genetic mutation rate as the fixation rate. Or when Jeffrey Tompkins made the claim that human DNA isn't as similar to chimp DNA as scientists would tell you. He used ungapped sequencing to get these results, and Erica Gibbon dismantled this, showing that using that method, a gene sequence has only about 85% similarity to itself. So I get why AIG doesn't want to do its own research. It's much easier to sit in your chair and critique the work of others, as I'm doing here. But dude, at least if that's what you're doing, own it. Will the rest of this video be more projecting? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and especially to my patrons and channel members. I want to thank all of you for the views on my last video. It got over 12,000 as I'm recording this, and it made me so happy. With that video, I also hit the 7,000 mark on subscribers. I need another 3,000 to hit the 10,000 mark. I'm trying to get myself a seat at the grown-ups table so I can attract more guests to my live streams. And I would appreciate any help you can give me in getting to the 10,000 mark. Back to Calvin and more projecting.
Many times, we are misled because we make errors in understanding that others were trying to convey.
You don't say. Like when you keep claiming that atheism is a religion, despite atheism not fitting any definition of a religion that I'm aware of, and you failing to give any definition where atheism fits. Yet you continue to make this claim.
And sometimes people deceive others purposefully.
Like when in your museum you claim a distinguishable difference between the ape kind and the human kind based on brain size, and yet in that display you omit an entire row of transitional species that blur the lines that you claim are so well defined.
To perhaps take advantage of someone monetarily or morally.
Right, and what's the price of admission at your museum? And how much money are you currently trying to raise to continue to spread your long-refuted junk science? Uh-huh.
Or to influence someone towards a certain ideology.
Can you even say with a straight face that that isn't the entire purpose of your ministry? If you weren't trying to influence people to a certain ideology, a false ideology, I wouldn't be here. I'd be fine with letting you believe any conspiracy theory that floats your boat, pun intended. But since you aren't content with that, but rather you peddle homeschooling curriculum intended to influence children that don't know any better, I am here to expose the hypocrisy that is your ministry.
Case in point, have you ever heard the oft-stated claim that people on average swallow 8 spiders a year while sleeping? Many people have heard it and have accepted it as true because it was presented based on scientific research that had proven it. And while you can dismiss it as laughable, which of course it is, many folks accepted the authority of the claim, and it became part of what they knew as true. And so they shared it with others, spreading the falsehood further.
Yeah, that happened, but it wasn't based on a scientific study, as Calvin here claims. Calvin should know this, as one of the images that he showed was this article from the Washington Post that says quite clearly that this originally was a joke. The name of the author of the original article, which appeared in PC Professional, not a science journal, was Lisa Burgett Holst, an anagram for "This is a big troll." Calvin, are you intentionally misrepresenting this urban legend as science in order to influence people to a certain ideology?
Now, if most people had taken a moment to think about it, who exactly set up infrared cameras and had a bunch of people sign up to be filmed in their sleep, or had a group of test subjects have their mouth and or stomach contacts checked daily for a year? They would have likely dismissed it as fake news. But despite the growing realization among people that what is often presented today as settled science is actually an agenda wrapped in cherry-picked data,
Careful there, Calvin. You are describing your entire organization. Keep exposing yourself there, and you could be out of a job. As you aptly point out, there never was any real science behind this idea. It was a joke that got out of hand. Anyone that looked into it found that there was no basis for the claim. It wasn't an agenda wrapped in cherry picked data, it was a joke that had no data to back it, as it wasn't intended to convince anyone that it was true, which is something I can't say for your ministry. Well, it is a joke. You continue to claim that evolution is limited to speciation and no species can evolve beyond its created kind. Yet you make this claim based on cherry picked data, ignoring all the data blurring the alleged lines between kinds that we get from animals like mudskippers, that are fish despite having lungs and being able to walk on land, or hyenas, which look more like dogs but are more closely related to cats. Yet, despite there being no evidence of a limiting factor that prevents evolution past a certain point, and you not being able to point to any mechanism for such a thing, you continue to make this claim that it exists, based on nothing but your interpretation of the Bible. An interpretation not shared by many of your fellow believers, who all ask you to stop with all of the name calling of heresy of anyone that disagrees with your interpretation. Could it be that even when it comes to theology, you cherry pick the verses that support your position in order to advance a particular ideology? Say it isn't so.
the general public's respect for science is still generally quite high.
Yes, because for now, this is the best we have. I agree that some studies are more credible than others. But when your studies are things like an engineer writing about cosmology and claiming that the speed of light is double going to the Earth as it is coming from the Earth, then one really needs to consider the source when looking at your studies. Thus far, I would classify this entire video as the pot calling the kettle black, because when it comes to putting out studies of dubious quality, AIG is at the top of the list. Even other creationists sometimes criticize the garbage that comes out of AIG.
And many fail to question data presented to them from so-called credible scientific studies, especially when they hear the same talking points repeated over and over again.
You mean like, were you there? Or, Noah took two of all the created kinds on the ark? Or, man is a special creation. He can't have evolved from other primates. Those kinds of talking points?
Have you ever heard someone say that evolution must be true because human and chimp's DNA are so similar? Statements like less than 1 to 2% difference in DNA have been thrown around in schools, colleges, museums, TV shows, and documentaries as if it were a fact for years now. Almost everyone has likely heard it, ever since a 1975 study was published. This misleading statistic has been cited as hard scientific evidence that humans and chimps share most of their genetic makeup, proving their supposed shared evolutionary ancestry.
Yes, this one is true. The human and chimp genome have been studied and they are remarkably similar. This is what I was referencing earlier when I referred to Jeffrey Tompkins. Tompkins is the solitary point, the cherry-picked data that is the likely source for this claim. And Tompkins has been thoroughly discredited on this point by Erica Gutzik-Gibbon, Glenn Williamson, and Dapper Dino, links in the description. Tompkins claimed Erica was being unfair in her criticism, but Tompkins also attempted to refute her data and eventually admitted that his methodology was flawed. Despite all of this having been available to you, Calvin, for over a month, you put this out 3 days ago, you are either paying no attention to the very point you claim superior knowledge of, or you are intentionally ignoring the data. Which is it, Calvin? Are you ignorant or lying? Most likely he is ignorant of the dialogue, as he appears to be just a spokesperson with no credentials of any science source. I wonder if he even understands the issue that he's discussing here. I didn't. I needed some people to explain to me what BLAST is. It's an acronym for Basic Local Alignment Search Tool and refers to a suite of programs used to generate alignments between nucleotide or protein sequences. Next, one needs to understand the difference between measuring gapped and ungapped sequences. Erica explains failing to gap the sequences as being similar to the difference between looking at a person's grades and failing to weight the grades, and then averaging the grades without taking the weight of each into account. So a student with 5 A's on 10-point quizzes and a D on a 300-point test doesn't understand why he got a C for the class instead of an A when he got mostly A's. In the same manner, Tompkins' failure to weight his data resulted in not only the inaccuracy of his results, one of the people that checked his work found that if you use his method to find DNA similarity, a gene is only about 85% similar to itself. Check out Erica's videos linked in the description for a full explanation of just how bad this claim is.
And this has been taught with such great authority and vigor that it has been used by the average Bible skeptic for years now as a cudgel against Bible-believing Christians who hold to the Genesis creation account.
Now, that is just your meme. You seem to have watched things like God's Not Dead movies and come to the conclusion that this really happens in classrooms. Teachers not teaching religion goes both ways. Not only can they not teach a particular religion as the right one, they also can't besmirch a religion that they don't agree with. The idea that teachers and professors use biology to try to prove the Bible is wrong is just you seeing what isn't there. Rather, they teach the facts and current mainstream thought on biology and leave it at that. The majority of Christians have no problem with evolution. It's only a small fraction, the young earthers, that agree with you. That you hold a minority position doesn't mean that you are wrong, but when entire fields of study and the experts in multiple disciplines are all wrong and you know better because you read your Bible, a book written by people who had no access to the methodology for these studies, and you think these people knew better because they were inspired by a God. Worse, you base that claim that they were inspired by God not on any evidence or claims by the authors themselves, but entirely on the claim of an unknown person that you know lied to you because he claimed to be Paul trying to get apostolic authority to back his claims. The early church fathers liked what he had to say and failed to see that they had been duped by some unknown writer. But with modern textual criticism, we now know better. Paul didn't write this. This is the only verse Christians use to hang their hat on biblical inspiration. Nowhere else in the Bible does it claim the Bible to be inspired by a God or to be the words of God. When your claims to inspiration are this flimsy, maybe it's time to consider that holding to the Genesis creation account lacks the authority that you claim.
To make them feel intellectually inferior and labeled as dim-witted science deniers.
No, that isn't the goal at all. The goal isn't to make you feel bad for holding an outdated and disproven position. The goal is to get you to look at the evidence and see that it isn't what you think it is. It's to get you to consider the possibility that you could be wrong and look with an open mind. The crux of the Bill Nye Ken Ham debate was that Nye said he would change his mind if shown evidence. Ham said he would change his mind never. No amount of evidence could ever convince him that he was wrong. His mind was closed to the possibility that he could be wrong, that he could interpret the Bible wrong, that he might have misunderstood. The goal is to get you to let go of the dogma and look, see, hear, then make a decision based on an intelligent choice. If you understand the evidence but don't find it convincing, then we've done all we can. But until we can get you to even consider the possibility, our job is not done. I do feel bad that that's how you see me and others like me. Maybe if you actually engaged with us instead of talking about us, you might learn that we aren't just trying to make you feel bad or stupid. I was a young earther myself until two things happened. First, I looked at the evidence, and second, I was given permission to not believe from my pastor who also didn't buy it. But if my pastor had told me that I had to believe it, I would have tried. And then I would have been stuck in the cognitive dissonance of professing to believe what I really didn't. Don't you also call that lying? Isn't that a sin? If so, then proclaiming young earth would be for me a sin. You wouldn't want me to sin now, would you?
It has been so powerful in convincing people as incontrovertible truth as to the legitimacy of the story of evolution.
Yes, because it's the foundation of much of our modern world. Modern medicine wouldn't work if it wasn't for evolution. We wouldn't be able to find oil if not for evolution. When 97% of the entire scientific community, not just evolutionary biologists, all agree that this is right, and the only reason that you claim that they are wrong is because a bunch of people several thousand years ago had a superstition that said otherwise, isn't exactly convincing.
It's even caused many a compromising Christian to adopt evolution as God's creative mechanism, despite its massive negative theological connotations.
Yup, even the majority of believers accept evolution.
A typical example of presenting such information comes from some signage at the Melbourne Museum in Australia, where the following declarations were on display accompanied by pictures of people and chimps. Too close for comfort? Believe it or not, our DNA is nearly identical to a chimpanzee's. Less than 2% of our DNA differs from theirs. DNA studies have altered our view of human evolution. They show that humans are apes. There is no missing link.
Yup, that's what the data shows. So what's your problem?
And so common is the argument that I continue to see skeptics bringing it up in comments on our social media sites to this day, accompanied with this pompous, contemptuous attitude, as if to say they simply can't believe I could be so misinformed about this fact of science.
Okay, you have a point about the opponents on social media. Social media can get nasty, but the street goes both ways. Your supporters on these same sites are equally nasty and make equal claims of ignorance regarding those of us who accept evolution. The difference is the evidence is on our side. If it weren't, you would be producing evidence, not complaining about the demeanor of your opponents.
But just like the 8 spiders a year story, it's simply not true.
There is no similarity at all. The spider story was a hoax, a joke. It was never intended to be taken seriously, as there was never any evidence to back it. No attempt was made to back it, as it was a joke. Evolution is not a joke. It's fact. Scientists have had to tweak ideas here and there as refining data is discovered, but the overall theory is sound. Again, it's the basis of modern medicine and so much more. You deny evolution while taking advantage of its reality.
In the rather revealing article from Science magazine titled Relative Differences, The Myth of 1%, whose name itself shows the gigs up as far as this only 1 to 2% difference argument goes, the evolution-believing author wrote the following. Genome-wise, referring to the DNA inside the nucleus of the cell, humans and chimpanzees are quite similar. But studies are showing that they're not as similar as many tend to believe. Indeed, they now say the 1 to 2% argument is a myth.
Do they now? Let's look at that article. But, truth be told, Wilson and King, the team that originally found the 1% difference, also noted that the 1% difference wasn't the whole story. They predicted that there must be profound differences outside of genes that focused on gene regulation to account for the anatomical and behavioral disparities between our knuckle-walking cousins and us. Researchers aligned 2.4 billion bases from each species and came up with a 1.23% difference. However, as the Chimpanzee Consortium noted, the figure reflects only the base substitutions, not the many stretches of DNA that have been inserted or deleted in the genomes. The Chimp Consortium calculated that these indels can disrupt genes and cause serious diseases, such as cystic fibrosis, and also accounted for a 3% additional difference. Entire genes are also routinely and randomly duplicated or lost, further distinguishing humans from chimps. In the December 2000 issue of PLIOS One, Hahn and co-workers reported that human and chimpanzee gene copy numbers differ by a whopping 6.4%, concluding that gene duplication and loss may have played a greater role in nucleotide substitution in the evolution of uniquely human phenotypes, and certainly a greater role than has been widely appreciated. Nowhere in the article do they say the 1 to 2% argument is a myth. Talk about cherry-picking your data. He lifted the subtitle for his quote, and I question if he even read the rest of the article. If he did, could he understand it? It is a bit technical. I didn't understand all of it myself. But the paper doesn't say that human DNA and chimp DNA is less similar than thought. Rather, that there are other factors other than the nucleotide sequencing that determines the differences between our species. Despite our genomes being remarkably similar, how the genes function in different species is based on other factors as well. This, Calvin, is why people who disagree with your point of view, I don't say atheists, as there are a lot of believers in this class as well, see you as dim-witted or dishonest. You take a paper that you either didn't read and you misrepresent it from your ignorance, or, worse, you read it and intentionally misrepresented it. If you have to misrepresent your opponent to prove your point, you have still failed to prove your point.
As happens so often, this particular icon of evolution has now been shown to be false. And yet the myth lingers in the minds of many, and likely will long after the truth has been disseminated into mainstream science.
If that ever happens, let me know. If you ever come up with a paper that says just that, I will take a look. Just as I took a look at the paper that you misrepresented here. Because your track record here isn't good, Kelvin. When you misrepresent the data like this, it means I have to check every point you bring up.
And most likely never truly understood the argument in the first place.
More projecting. I seriously doubt that Kelvin understood this article.
You see, many lay people had the simplistic view that scientists somehow lined up all the individual DNA letters from both a chimp and human genomes side by side, and voila, 98% of the letters were in exactly the same place.
Did anyone think that? I certainly didn't. I'll admit that I needed this explained to me, as it is not in my field, and some of the papers are too technical for me. Rather, I listened to the claim and really had no thoughts on how it worked until it became an issue. Once it became the point of contention, then I listened to both sides. On Erica's side, she has extensive work to back her claims. Tompkins admitted to using the erroneous methodology that Erica exposed. This should be case closed for the creationist claims. Yet here Calvin is, still clinging to them desperately, like a life raft.
Not a good feeling, eh?
When he doesn't seem to have noticed that Erica blew a huge hole in his raft. Calvin, there's a boat right next to you. Get on board. You'll find the floor much less shaky here.
Like looking at a copy of a book and comparing it to a revised edition and discovering there was only a 2% difference in word content. But this simply isn't the case. The original 98 to 99% similarity claim only referred to substitutions in aligned regions where human and chimp DNA have different bases or letters. However, this isn't considering the many other differences in their DNA as well. For example, there are gaps in the aligned region where there is human DNA but no matching chimp DNA, or vice versa. And there are also millions of bases outside the aligned regions that don't match whatsoever, but that aren't counted in the DNA similarity argument's conclusion. A few examples of publications revealing some of the differences over the years are as follows. In 2003, scientists calculated a 13.3% difference in sections of our immune system when the insertions and deletions are considered.
True, but this wasn't a divergence from the original 98% similarity. This is the study he is referencing. When scientists compared the indels, the insertions and deletions, the similarity is lower in these regions. If I'm reading this correctly, please correct me if I'm not, this brings us closer to understanding the evolutionary mechanism for the divergence of our species. What any layperson should be able to see from this paper is rather than being evidence of a special creation or a dismantling of a common argument for evolution, this paper is telling us that we are getting closer to a better understanding of how evolution works. This paper supports the conclusion that humans evolved from chimpanzees. It doesn't dismantle it.
In 2005, scientists discovered that the chimpanzee genome was 12% larger than the human genome.
The alleged study that he cites here is an article on CMI's website by creationist Daniel Anderson. Who is Daniel Anderson? We don't know. According to CMI, this is a pseudonym for a prolific creationist writer. Great. No credentials, no bio, no way of knowing who this random dude is that writes so much of your stuff. So I click on the supporting article for the claim in question, and it takes me back to the study that we were looking at earlier that said that there were factors other than the nucleotide sequencing that determines the differences between our species, despite the genomes being remarkably similar. How the genes function in the different species is based on other factors as well. So his second study is the same one that he misrepresented about 5 minutes ago.
In 2006, a study of gene copy numbers revealed a 6.4% difference.
Here's the study that Kelvin is referencing, and again, Kelvin has cherry-picked a single sentence from the abstract to draw an erroneous conclusion. This paper is far too technical for me to understand all of it, and I'm sure the same is true of Kelvin, who, unlike me, likely was given a script to read, rather than doing his own research. After all, he is merely a spokesperson for a large organization. I did all the research myself, but then I asked Erica to confirm my understanding of what is being said here. I don't have a response from her yet, but if I get one before I finish this video, it will be here, and if I get one later, I'll make a short video to tell you what she said. The end of the discussion section of this paper says, although the alignment of orthologous genomic regions has shown that there is less than 2% divergence between humans and chimpanzees at the nucleotide level, these analyses per force do not consider unalignable or ambiguously aligned regions. The contrast, our results, demonstrate that humans and chimpanzees differ by about 6% at the level of the gene complement. So while I don't fully understand the difference, it is clear the paper is not saying there was an error in the earlier finding of a less than 2% difference in the two genomes. Rather, the difference is greater when other factors are considered, similar to the last paper. Once again, Kelvin is misrepresenting the findings.
And a 2007 study revealed a 17.4% difference in gene expression in the cerebral cortex.
Kelvin, or rather whoever wrote Kelvin's script for him, got really tricky here. The study he cites here, Cohen, Relative Differences, is again the same article that we've seen twice before. This was published in 2007. The last time he referenced it, he called it a 2005 study, as the article cited a 2005 study for the sentence that he was using. But this time, the same article is a 2007 study, likely trying to make it sound like he has more sources than he does. The sentence he is referencing says, in the cortex, for example, 17.4% of the connections were specific to humans. Gershwin and coworkers reported in the 21 November 2006 proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So it clearly was not a 2007 study. Not that the date of the study is all that important, but what is important is the way AIG is continually misrepresenting the findings and taking the statements out of context to try to make it appear that these articles support their position when they don't. The story we get from each of these sources is the same. The DNA is remarkably similar. When we compare certain parts, we start finding the greater differences that will likely eventually allow us to better understand the mechanism of evolution.
And I could go on. However, if all of the presently known differences were counted and combined, studies currently show a total of 600 million differences between human and chimp DNA, which drops the similarity down to only 80%, a trend likely to continue as our information about genetics grows even more.
I searched for support for this claim as Calvin doesn't cite his sources in his description, and he's failed to give us a reference here. The only result I could find that cited the 6 million differences was this article from, drumroll please, Answers in Genesis. It's an article by Georgia Purdom. Her first reference is to the Cohen article that Calvin has already cited twice, and her next reference for her claims of dissimilarity is Jeffrey Tompkins, of course, from Answers Research Journal, which is published by Answers in Genesis. Jeffrey Tompkins' work has been thoroughly demolished by Erica Gutsick-Gibbon with the help of Dapper Dino and Glenn Williamson. A link to the playlist of the series of videos where she does this is also in the description.
Now, I can already hear the keyboard warriors out there viciously clicking away, blasting off comments like, but it's still 80% alike, implying that any great amount of similarity within creatures still lends weight to the evolutionary story.
Glad he could hear me on my keyboard writing the script to respond, but he missed by a mile as to the response. I'm not accepting your numbers at face value. Rather, I'm fact-checking your data and finding you really don't have as much to back your claims as you would have the audience think. You have cited your own organization and 2 outside sources that still say that there is a 98% similarity in the genome. They are finding greater differences in portions, but this still hasn't changed the original findings.
By somehow demonstrating a close ancestral relationship between them. However, despite the obvious, namely that their similarity numbers have been dropping like stock prices at Disney lately.
Good one, Calvin. Except you didn't even get that right. Disney stock is up today, and it has been for the last 4 days. You released this 3 days ago. But it's also been up for the last 4 months. You have to go back to October to even try to make this statement true. If the similarity between human and chimp DNA was really comparable to the stock market, it would be back on the rise again.
Fellow evolutionist Steve Jones has already addressed that misconception. We also share about 50% of our DNA with bananas, and that doesn't make us half bananas, either from the waist up or the waist down.
True, which is the reason for the studies you cited here, Calvin. Scientists are specifically looking for the reasons for our differences, despite the genomic similarity. They aren't looking to prove evolution. That's been done. They've moved on long ago. Calvin, you and the rest of your young Earth creationists have missed the boat.
See, we're leaving, baby. Now they start running.
Bye-bye. Enjoy your flight home.
But it's not too late. Unlike the Ark, no one is sending a flood to drown you for not seeing it correctly the first time.
The fact is, all living things share similar organic building blocks and a similar genetic coded language, DNA, that contains the instructions for the construction, operation, and maintenance of whatever genome we could discuss.
True, all living things have a common ancestor. We are all related. That's why all living things are made out of the same stuff, DNA.
But neither genetic similarity nor anatomical similarity necessarily equates to an evolutionary ancestry. That made-up history is simply imposed on the facts we observe.
Imposed? You mean the way you impose your interpretation of the Bible on people? No. It isn't imposed. It's the best conclusion from the evidence. If it weren't, it would have been rejected long ago. The fact that your attempts to dismantle evolution never proved to be accurate further supports the theory. If the evidence really were as strong as you claim, you wouldn't have to resort to misrepresenting the articles, citing the same article 3 times, and then giving it different dates each time to try to make it sound like 3 separate studies, or cherry-picking the sentences that you like from an article to try to make it say what it doesn't say.
A startling example illustrating this came from a journal article describing results from the prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where scientists discovered that bats and horses share a higher degree of similarity in distribution of a genetic element than cows and horses do.
Calvin, have you even looked at the article?
I don't think it means what you think it means.
Bats really are more closely related to horses than cows. Just because cows and horses both have 4 legs and hooves doesn't mean they are closely related. Horses are also more closely related to dogs and cats than they are to cows. Not only that, this was not the discovery of the article. I read the whole thing, and the claim you make here isn't even in the article. I like that you picked an article from a reputable source, but taking good articles and misrepresenting them to try to make them support your presuppositions when they don't just makes you look sleazy and dishonest. The article was actually about a proposed new superorder of Pegasophere, if I pronounced that correctly, which would incorporate bats, horses, and a number of extinct animals. Scientists have for some time been refining the Linnaean classification system, adding clades to more accurately classify animals. I think you were misled by the title of the article. The word unexpected there seems to make you think that the results were a surprise to the scientists, but the article doesn't support that thought. Just as you don't judge a book by its cover, you really can't determine the content of an article from its title. What makes me sad is Calvin sits there smugly thinking that he has proven his point, and his audience will just eat it up as the work to check out his claims takes hours. If what he's saying supports what you already think, you have no reason to check out his claims. You just accept that he knows. After all, he's a Christian, and a Christian wouldn't lie now, would he?
I mean, you likely couldn't find 2 more distinct placental mammals than horses and bats, according to evolutionary predictions based on comparative anatomy.
Which is why classification isn't based on comparative anatomy. When Linnaeus devised the system 300 years ago, he used method of reproduction as his primary classification tool. He put bats in the same order as primates. Considering that cows and horses have never been considered in the same order, and, according to you, God made each of the created kinds, for which is the most part family, to be distinct, such that there can be no evolution between them, by your own classification system, cows and horses are no more alike than bats and horses. So why are you bypassing your own system to make this claim?
But they shared a greater genetic similarity than horses and cows.
Yes, which is why the 300-year-old system is being revised to take into account classification methods available to us today that were not available to Linnaeus. Evolution hadn't even been discovered when he wrote this classification. Darwin wasn't even born yet. And remarkably, his classification system pointed to the possibility of evolution. I spent about 6 hours looking up all the articles, reading them, and then asking Erica to check my work, as some of these articles were too technical for me. That's why I need to keep doing this. Few believers would ever go to this much effort to expose Calvin's smoke and mirrors.
Think about it. As a simplistic analogy regarding the whole homology or similarity argument often used by evolutionists, if I lined up a spoon, a spork, and a fork, would their shapes be evidence of one having evolved into another?
Elsa? Do you want to build a straw man?
You picked 3 man-made objects. Clearly, they didn't evolve because they can't reproduce. No one has ever suggested that an object evolved from another object that can't reproduce because it has a similar shape. A pizza and the sun have similar shapes as well. No one has ever suggested that pizzas evolved from the sun.
Or would it be more likely evidence of them having been designed by the same creator?
Look at that smug face. Before something can be designed by a creator needs to exist. When you produce your model for how a creator can design the natural world, I will consider your claim. But I seriously doubt that you can produce any such model in my lifetime.
You see, a little red wagon, a tricycle, a bicycle, a Honda Civic, and a Lamborghini are all quite different. and yet all have various similar component parts as well. And that's because an intelligent designer would use similarly effective and useful parts in a wide variety of applications.
Those are all man-made objects. They don't reproduce. Have you ever seen a spoon give birth? Can a spoon baby adapt to its environment? No, it can't. When you show me a spoon that produces offspring, then you will have a valid analogy. Credit Dapper Dino. Spoons are man-made. We can not only produce models showing how humans can make such things, we can even show you videos of people actually making spoons. Let's see you do that, Calvin. Give us a video of God creating an animal, or at least a model of how God could create an animal. You can't do it. If there really were an all-powerful, all-knowing God that wanted us to know that He could and did do this, He could produce a video of Him doing it. It should be an easy thing for Him. You don't have any problem making your videos to explain your God. If your God cares as much as you do about people believing Him, why is He unable to do as much as you?
So the whole similarity equals proof of evolution argument is dubious regardless.
Which is why it alone isn't the argument. It really helps to understand the argument before you try to refute it.
The fact is that the argument for 98% similarity between humans and chimps is now dead and buried. And yet, I predict its ghost will live on and be believed and used by skeptics and referenced as proof of the story of evolution for decades to come.
That's a pretty good prediction. Since the evidence doesn't show what you claim, the similarity is still there. But the differences are likely to be the keys to better understanding of the evolutionary process. Live your life.